The Oculus brand sure did have a history over the past decade. It originally started in 2012 with an incredibly successful Kickstarter campaign reaching 2.4 million US dollars, roughly 10 times the original amount it needed. A few years after the Kickstarter success and the release of a first development kit version of the Oculus Rift, Facebook will go ahead and buy out the company. And while it may have been a decision that will end up being a massive mistake seen by many, the team behind the company were celebrating this nonetheless. Over the following years, the company will release retail products off the Oculus lineup, making the company the #1 star in the VR industry. And now, in the current year of 2023, things have changed a lot. Oculus has released several devices from the portable lineup of VR devices, starting with the Oculus Go, followed up by the Oculus Quest, and finally, their biggest product yet, as it's now unfortunately called, the Meta Quest 2. And as you could probably guess, I too own a Quest 2. God, that's a little bit of a tongue twister. The main reasons why I wanted a Quest 2 is pretty simple. 1. Half-Life Alyx was a game that I very desperately wanted to play for myself, and 2. The Homebrew Scene. The device has been out for almost 3 years at this point, 2 of which I actually owned device during that period, so I think it will be interesting to look back at the device itself. Keep in mind that I still use the Quest 2, however mainly for the PC VR side, which I'll get into a brief moment as well. Now, without further ado, here's the hidden homebrew goldmine off the Oculus Quest 2. Oh yeah, you probably noticed that I am referring this to its original name instead of Meta Quest 2, and the reason for that is just, I think Meta Quest 2 is a stupid name, and there's nothing more else about it. So before I begin with the main part of this video, I think it's fair that we shall talk about the device itself. There are 2 models available for the Quest 2 that you can order, the first one being the 128GB model, and the other one being the 256GB model. The model I own is actually a 64GB model, which was discontinued 6 months after the Quest 2 launched, and instead got replaced by the 128GB model instead. In all honesty, looking back, I kind of regret buying the 64GB model, but at the same time, I rarely play any games on the Quest 2 itself, aside from like a few and all the source ports, so I'm not too upset about it. The design of the headset itself is pretty fine, but I have a few issues with it personally. The face cover of the headset itself comes with this foam material, which is pretty awful in and of itself because all the sweat you might build from using the headset goes directly into the foam like a sponge, so I ordered a facial interface and foam replacement set from VR Cover, which doesn't have this problem at all. Oh yeah, the default head strap for the device kinda sucked too, so I ordered a knockoff lead head strap for $40 off of Amazon, and it does its job. On the front side, you have 4 cameras on each corner that act as the sensors for the controllers, removing the need to set them up manually. Then you got a USB-C input and headphone jack input on the left side, a power button on the right side, and volume up and down buttons under the headset. Moving on to the controllers, you get a pair of them, each designed for both hands, which both feel very comfortable. I tried the HTC Vive before I got the Quest, and while I liked the headset itself, I couldn't say the same thing about the controllers. They didn't feel that way at all. So going over from the Vive controllers to the Quest 2 controllers felt like a major upgrade to my hands. I understand they're not made by the same company, and this is totally unrelated to the video, but I can still mention it now, can't I? Let's talk about the capabilities of the device itself. After you set things up and log in for your Meta account, you'll be able to explore the menu and, more importantly, get some VR apps and games working. After all, it is advertised for no need of getting a console or PC to play the games. You can still use the headset to connect to your PC, which is a pretty nice feature to have, but I'll set that aside for later. The performance of games on the Oculus Quest 2 itself is surprisingly competent enough to get games usually running at a stable frame rate. Even games I was sure of not being able to run smoothly ended up running smoothly anyways, which is a massive plus in my eyes. That comes, however, with a slight downside in visual quality in order to get some games running on the Quest 2 at all. The Walking Dead Saints and Sinners in particular looks fine on something like the Quest 2, but then you switch over to something like on PSVR and PCVR and yeah, it looks way better over there. That being said, some games on the Quest 2 look amazing. Bone Lab looks quite decent on that device for a game that heavily relies on the physics engine, and that alone is a pretty impressive feat. So, overall, I think the device itself is impressively powerful enough, given that its main source of horsepower is a Qualcomm Snapdragon XR2. As mentioned earlier, one of the Quest 2's biggest advantages is that it's also a great device for the usage of PC VR. The easiest way to do that is to connect a USB 3.0 cable that's long enough to let you move around next to your computer, that also should be very powerful enough to even run VR games smoothly in the first place, connect via Oculus Link, and start playing. Unfortunately though, I can't go through with this option for two reasons. The first one, my room is way too small to use as a reliable VR space, and even if I do find a space for it, it usually ends up with me hurting my hands in some way when I move around, which probably should be an understandable choice on not wanting to move around in VR in such a tiny space. The other one is kinda a bizarre one too. The Oculus app does not want to work on my current PC at all. It worked on my old one, which in all honesty wasn't even suitable enough for playing these games, but it still worked, so that's bad. However, there is thankfully a way for me to play PC VR games through the Quest regardless, and that's my preferred method of playing. On the Oculus Quest store, yes, that's what I continue on calling it by the way, there's an application called Virtual Desktop, which allows you to stream over your desktop onto your Quest 2. More importantly, it also allows you to play VR games through streaming as well. The only downside I can really think of is that the software costs $20, but other than that, this is still a great way to play VR games in the first place. And I know that some people are going to come up and mention to me that Oculus has its own free alternative called AirLink. I tried that before Virtual Desktop and the experience I had was not good. I had to experience a painfully slow 5-second delay, which not only baffled me because my PC was hooked up through a LAN cable with a very fast internet connection, but it also made me incredibly nauseous and just feel awful in general, so I decided to ditch AirLink in favor of Virtual Desktop. I really like Virtual Desktop. It not only eliminates the issue of my Oculus app problem, but also allows me to just move to a much bigger room with far more space to use for moving around in VR. There's also no movement lag in any way at all, which is great for games that use precise movement, like Beat Saber for example. Also, another incredible feature of Virtual Desktop is being able to access your games through its own in-app menu without opening Steam VR or going to the Oculus VR Home, which is great for quick and easy access. More importantly, however, is that the PC VR experience with Virtual Desktop through streaming is, dare I say it, flawless. There isn't a single inch of the previously mentioned movement and input lag, nor any issues with video streaming quality on my end, making this my all-time favorite way of experiencing VR. As for the actual PC VR experience, well, it really depends on the PC you're using. If you have a powerful enough computer that can run something as demanding as, say, Half-Life Alyx, you're set for life. If not, well, things are going to be very hard. For context, my old PC with specs that I cannot remember for the life of me, with the exception of a GTX 1070 and 16GB of RAM, had issues running something like Half-Life Alyx for example. By no means unplayable, but far from smooth either. Last year I did build a whole new PC which is much more powerful than the old one, holding a 3070 Ti, 32GB of RAM, and finally a AMD Ryzen 9 5950X, and the performance of that game on this PC ended up being far better and smoother than the old one. It also depends on the game you're playing, and there are plenty of VR games. But overall, using the Quest 2 to play VR games on PC is a very nice experience. It's my favorite go-to way of playing PC VR content. As for how long it'll be that case, well, time will only tell. Alright, now let's get to the main course of this whole thing. Long story short, there's a platform unrelated to the Quest store named SideQuest that focuses on applications you can just sideload onto the Quest 2 and play them. Obviously, this isn't a place where you download pirated versions of paid games. That's not going to fly because Facebook will ban you for doing that, but it's instead just games made by singular developers for people to go and play, including unofficial VR ports of a lot of older games, which is what I'll be focusing on. Now, some of these ports have been around before, specifically on PC, but I will be mainly focusing on the VR ports made for the Quest instead of the ones on PC, although I will mention a PC VR equivalent of any of these ports if needed. All of the ports I'm showing off in this video were made by the folks over at Team Beef, who have ported a good amount of games I'll be showing off in this video onto the Quest. So I want to thank them first and foremost for all the effort they put into making these ports possible in the first place. Without further ado, let's get on to it. Doom probably needs no introduction whatsoever. It's a first-person shooter from the early 90s that made waves during that period, and still manages to stick around, no thanks to the very dedicated community this franchise has. There's a good reason people call Doom the grandfather of first-person shooters, and to its credit, it is one of the few games from that time that aged like fine wine. So naturally, a VR port on the Quest was bound to happen. Introducing QuestZDoom, a port based on the popular GZDoom source port on the Quest lineup. If it wasn't obvious enough, this does not come with any of the Doom games because you'll have to obtain the game files by yourself and extract them into the QuestZDoom folder. Other than that, it's pretty much what you expect it to be. Doom on the Quest, working fully in VR. The controls are pretty simple and do their job, meaning no need to manually change the control settings in-game. More importantly, because of QuestZDoom being based on the GZDoom source port, means that mods are working on QuestZDoom as well, including mods designed to be played in GZDoom. Of course, there are numerous examples, but I'm sure there are a few mods that come to mind when you think of GZDoom compatibility. There's also, of course, a selection of add-ons you can install from the launcher, like Sigil, John Romero's unofficial 5th episode of Doom, a fan-made faithful recreation of Wolfenstein 3D in QuestZDoom, and finally, Doom 64 Retribution, working fully in QuestZDoom. Although I have noticed that it likes to lag quite a bit when the skybox is visible for some reason. So overall, QuestZDoom is a pretty decent port off a GZDoom source port onto the Quest, which is great. Go check it out, it's on SideQuest. As for any PC equivalents, there is one I found by the name of GZDoomVR over on GitHub. And as you could expect it by the name, it's exactly what it is. I do, however, believe that QuestZDoom feels a lot more advanced than this, but it still does a great job. I tried playing this lovingly crafted tribute map for a deceased friend someone made off her house, and it works pretty well. You should check it out too. With that out of the way, let's move on to the next one. While we're on the subject, let's talk about a game that people argue is a better experience when played in virtual reality. Doom 3 is often looked down upon for being so different from the rest of the franchise, particularly because of the horror direction it's going for, and overall for being a lot more slower paced than every single other entry in the franchise. And while I do believe that Doom 3 is still a pretty good game overall, I have to admit that the idea of a game like Doom 3 being the perfect fit for a VR experience sounds quite exciting. Now, right off the bat, I want to clarify that a lot of the features of the Quest port of Doom 3 are based on a completely different VR mod for Doom 3 BFG edition named Doom 3 BFG Fully Possessed, which is a very great VR mod for Doom 3 BFG edition. This Quest version, however, is a port of a game based on the original Doom 3 source code, which doesn't really matter anyways because you get both the original and the BFG edition if you buy them on Steam. As for the experience of Doom 3 in VR, I can only say that it's probably one of the best experiences I had playing a game in VR. Of course, it's not nearly as immersive as someone would expect, but it still makes up for a grand fun time. So overall, I can highly recommend Doom 3 Quest and Doom 3 BFG Fully Possessed at the same time. Alright, I nearly forgot to mention this, but Doom 3 also received an official VR port back in 2021. The only problem is that this port is, even while I'm working on this video, exclusive to the PlayStation VR. There's no official word on a PC port coming anytime soon, and if you're one of the 5 people on the planet who own a PSVR 2 for the PlayStation 5, prepare to get disappointed, because it's neither backwards compatible or ported over to the PlayStation VR 2. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and skip Quake 1 and 2 entirely for this, not because the ports in question are bad, far from it, it's just that they're not nearly as interesting to talk about in direct comparison to the next thing that I'll be showing. Team Beef did the unthinkable and ported over Quake 3 Arena, a multiplayer-focused arena shooter, onto the Quest as a fully working VR title. You might be thinking to yourself, there's no way a game that is as fast-paced as Quake 3 is ever gonna work on something like a VR environment. And to that, I say you're wrong. Quake 3 Arena works surprisingly great in VR, especially in a game where precise aiming is the key to winning. The controls for this port felt incredibly well, and I had no issues fragging bots in the single-player mode on Hurt Me Plenty difficulty. Another thing that really surprised me when trying the latest version out is that this port has an actual working weapon wheel selection where you hold press on the right controller stick and move the controller to the weapon of choice, which is a very unique thing given how previous ports by Team Beef usually required you to move the right stick up or down to switch weapons. This port also comes with a so-called companion with the sole purpose of downloading maybe some map packs and I think some mods too. But other than that, it's very basic. As a matter of fact, it's literally just the QuestZDoom launcher we worked for Quake 3 instead. Also, I'm not entirely sure if this was a bug or intentional, but I do like how once you die, you get to see this miniature view off a map you're currently playing with all the other players on it as if you're watching it from a distance. Either way, this is a very excellent port of Quake 3 Arena into a VR environment. Definitely a refreshing way to play one of the greatest multiplayer games of all time. Lastly, I have some bad news for the PC audience of players because as far as I'm aware of, there is no official VR mod or VR port of Quake 3 onto PC, which is a bit of a shame because it's one I can definitely see people playing. Now, if this had a crossplay support between PC players and VR users like what some certain games do, I think it will make more of a fun time. Let me just get the disappointment right out of the way and say that this next port does also not have a VR mod of any sort, so if you're on PC, I've got some bad news. With that out of the way, here's Return to Castle Wolfenstein in VR through RTCWQuest, a port job of RTCW through a IO RTCW fork. And it's pretty much what you expect it to be, Return to Castle Wolfenstein in VR. I have really nothing to add on this other than it's pretty cool to see Team Beef porting over a game I would have never expected to get ported onto VR. And hey, remember that Wolfenstein 3D total conversion for QuestZDoom I mentioned earlier? Combine it with that and you have 2 classic Wolfenstein games working fully in VR, which is also pretty cool. So if you want to play through some old school Wolfenstein games, there you have it. Alright, this last one's cheating at this point, but just hear me out. The next port is actually a officially sold port on the Quest 2 store, and this port is none other than the original Resident Evil 4 from 2005. What makes this port so unique is that out of all the ports that I have shown so far, is that this one takes it a little step further than any other ports I have shown in this video, and it manages to make the entirety of the game it was based on work in a VR environment beautifully. There are a few key points about this port that makes it so incredible. The first and the most obvious one being is the camera shift. Because in case you're not aware of, the original Resident Evil 4 uses a third-person camera angle, whereas this port is in first person. This change still works very well because it creates a whole different kind of tension because you're now seeing all kinds of monsters up close to your eyes instead of seeing them afar next to Leon, which is quite a unique and good change. The second one being the balancing around the game. Since the VR port needed major changes in the controls department to make the game work in VR, the developers had to take some necessary changes in order to make the VR port just as difficult as the original game. Some changes I think I noticed were the knife dealing a lot less damage than before now, possibly due to the fact that the player can swing it much faster than Leon did in the original, enemies taking overall less damage and also dealing as much damage to the player as they will do in professional if you're playing on normal, and probably many more I can't think off the top of my head. Some other balances outside the core difficulty also had to be made, most notably with the merchant completely removing reload speed upgrades, which makes sense considering the player can literally reload the weapons by themselves, making the upgrade option for reload speeds completely pointless. And one that I won't necessarily count as a balancing change, but more a fun change to the shooting range, where you need to complete weapon-based courses in order to get all the statues, which, in case you don't know, means that you're no longer just limited to like 2 loadouts. No, you have several weapons you can choose from and just shoot with them, which is pretty fun. And speaking of which, the last point being to make Resident Evil 4's gameplay fun in VR. As mentioned before, Resident Evil 4's core gameplay had to be tweaked and work in a virtual reality environment, and I'd say that they delivered on that. You don't need to constantly swap between weapons and items from your inventory, with the game giving you 4 slots on your body, with one being for your primary, your secondary weapon, one for the grenade of your choice, and your healing item of choice. And of course the extra slot for the knife, but you can't obviously change it into something else. The movement has also been altered to fit the VR controlling style, but don't expect it to make the game any easier because enemies are way tankier and stronger than in the original game. Of course, like with the case of a recently released 2023 remake, standing still and aiming your shots right is still the best way to accurately deal with enemies. But by far the biggest change they have done in this VR port is the world interaction. All the previous VR ports I mentioned usually required you to press a use key on the controller to make it work, but here, everything relies on the use of your hands. Want to pull a lever? Grab it with a controller and move it. Want to open a closet? Grab a knob with a controller and move it to open it up. That crystal ball door puzzle from a second chapter, position it right by grabbing it with a controller and rotating it with a controller. This is easily the coolest change they have brought to this game, and I cannot overstate how much love they put into this port. Putting all of these things into perspective results in Resident Evil 4 VR being one of the most fun I had playing any game in VR, especially in the gameplay department. There's nothing more satisfying than shooting a Ganado to the ground and slashing him to death with a knife, or shooting a group of Ganados with a shotgun, then pulling out my pistol and shooting another one that's coming in my direction. It is just that much fun. But of course, there are a few things wrong with this port. For starters, and probably a lot more nitpicky, but I'm just gonna bring this up anyways, the developers thought it would be a wise decision to remove any instances of the characters being flirty with each other, most notably with any interactions between Leon and Hunnigan. But one of the worst cuts has to be Lewis's comments on Ashley's, well, you know what.
Small world, eh? Well, I see that the president's equipped his daughter with ballistics, too.
How rude! And I don't believe there's any relevance with my figure and my standing. Who are you?
What makes this even worse is that, with the comment being cut, it now makes it look like Ashley is angry at Lewis for no reason, making this cut even weirder.
Small world, eh?
Who are you?
Oh, excuse me, your highness.
However, this next issue I'm gonna bring up is gonna make the censorship look like nothing in comparison, because for some odd reason, Resident Evil 4 VR is exclusive to the Quest 2. Now, this might seem like a bit of a weird point to make, because the whole focus of this video was primarily on the Quest 2 and the experience with the device, and while Resident Evil 4 VR is a fantastic VR port of Resident Evil 4, I can't help but feel like that Resident Evil 4, with how much of a legacy it left behind, is the type of game to just not belong exclusively to this device, especially if it's an incredible VR conversion of the original Resident Evil 4, because overlooking these few negatives, I honestly would consider putting Resident Evil 4 on the exact same level of VR quality as Half-Life Alyx. It's just that good, even if it's yet another Resident Evil 4 port. But hey, only time will tell when people manage to get this game working on PC, unofficially, or through some future BlueStacks hackery. So, I have to admit, the editing process for this video took me way longer than anticipated, mostly because of some stuff IRL happening, but that's not important. And I felt like the very last few seconds of this video that I recorded after what you just heard will have dragged the video out longer than it needed, so I'm just gonna give you the quick version of the conclusion. The Quest 2 is, in its current state, totally worth it. In fact, when Meta announced the upcoming Quest 3 just recently, they did a major price drop for the Quest 2, which currently costs $300 for the 128GB model, and $350 for the 256GB model, making this by far the currently cheapest VR headset on market. And don't forget, this device can do way more than just stuff from the Quest store, especially in the Homebrew Scene, where it's been proven that you can experience some great classic games fully in VR without needing a powerful computer. So for that price, I'd say that getting the device now before the Quest 3 launches is totally worth it. You could also just totally wait for the Quest 3 to come out and buy that instead. I'm sure it'll be awesome as well. Anyways, thank you so much for watching this. I'm gonna start shifting content a little after this one. Don't worry, it's still staying video game related mostly, but I want to change up the way I do content as well, because looking at how long it's been since the last one, yeah, I think shifting things a little won't hurt. Though, I'm still gonna make sure that things stay interesting on this channel. With that out of the way, see you next time.
Dear Mario, 10 years in the joint.